Picture this. May 4th, 1949. A village school near Plzeň, Czechoslovakia, where communist authorities have just seized power in February 1948's coup, and where American military personnel are conducting final withdrawal operations before Soviet-dominated government expels all Western presence from the country. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood, a 28-year-old U.S. Army medic from Philadelphia assigned to medical liaison duties with Czech civilian hospitals, examines patients at a temporary clinic established in the school building, treating civilians who'd relied on American medical assistance during 4 years since liberation. At 14:23 hours, he radios Medical Command in Frankfurt, confirming completion of patient assessments and estimating departure within 2 hours as withdrawal deadline approaches. At 14:26 hours, a Czech schoolteacher approaches Blackwood with urgent message about injured students hiding in the school's basement, children who'd been beaten by communist security forces for participating in anti-regime protests but who couldn't seek treatment at official hospitals where authorities would identify them as dissidents. At 14:29 hours, Blackwood makes the decision that will define his fate. He tells his medical team he's conducting assessment of reported injuries, taking supplies in case treatment is needed, and estimating return within 30 minutes before final convoy departs. For 76 years, Sergeant Thomas Blackwood will not return from that Czech school basement. Search parties sent when he fails to reach the withdrawal convoy will find the school exactly as he described, but no evidence of Blackwood or the injured students he went to help. Just empty classrooms and the echo of footsteps that descended basement stairs and never climbed back up. Until 2025, when Czech renovation workers preparing the school for historic preservation discover that the basement contains sealed rooms behind walls that architectural plans never acknowledged, finding medical supplies from 1949, documents in Blackwood's handwriting, and evidence that he didn't die on that May day. He discovered something that 3 governments had spent 76 years ensuring stayed buried beneath Czech soil and Cold War history. Thomas Blackwood wasn't supposed to be in Czechoslovakia. His assignment had been Austria, providing medical support for American occupation forces. But in late 1948, when deteriorating political situation in Czechoslovakia created concerns about treatment of civilians and about maintaining contact with Czech medical professionals who'd cooperated with American personnel since liberation, Medical Command had requested volunteers for temporary liaison duty in Prague and regional cities. Blackwood had volunteered, motivated by curiosity about Eastern Europe and by desire for experience that might advance his medical career after military service ended. His assignment to Plzeň in western Czechoslovakia came during a critical period. The February 1948 communist coup had created a government aligned with Moscow, and Soviet authorities were pressuring Czechs to expel remaining Western personnel before they could establish intelligence networks or support anti-communist resistance. American withdrawal had been negotiated for spring 1949, giving medical liaison personnel a few months to complete handovers to Czech authorities and to ensure that civilians who'd relied on American assistance wouldn't be abandoned completely. Blackwood's personal letters, preserved by his brother James in Philadelphia and donated to military archives in 2020, documented his experiences during those final months. In April 1949, just weeks before his disappearance, he'd written words that James would reread obsessively for decades. The situation here is deteriorating rapidly. The communists are consolidating control, arresting anyone they view as politically unreliable. Teachers, doctors, priests, students, anyone who speaks against the regime or who's suspected of maintaining contact with Western personnel. The Czech medical professionals I've been working with are terrified. Some are fleeing to the west while border crossings are still possible. Others are staying, trying to continue providing care despite political pressures that make independent medical practice increasingly impossible. And I'm caught between obligations to withdraw as ordered and awareness that leaving means abandoning people who trusted American promises of support. His final letter, mailed on May 2nd, contained observations that would haunt investigators for 76 years. There are reports about students being beaten for anti-communist activities. They can't seek treatment at official hospitals because doing so would identify them to security services. Some are suffering serious injuries that could become life-threatening without proper care. Czech doctors who treat them risk arrest for assisting enemies of the people. And American medics like me face difficult choices about whether medical ethics require helping regardless of political complications or whether discretion requires leaving such matters to Czech authorities who understand local risks better than we do. The village school near Plzeň where Blackwood was working on May 4th had been converted to temporary medical clinic during American withdrawal, allowing personnel to complete final patient assessments before departure. The building was a typical rural Czech school, constructed in the early 1900s with classrooms on upper floors and storage areas in the basement that had been used during German occupation for various purposes that local residents preferred not to discuss in detail. Blackwood's decision to investigate the basement on May 4th had been made based on information from a Czech teacher named Eva Novotná, who'd approached the American medical team claiming that 6 students were hiding below, injured during protests against communist educational reforms that emphasized Marxist ideology over traditional Czech culture. Novotná had pleaded for American medical assistance, arguing that these students represented Czechoslovakia's future, and that abandoning them to communist authorities meant condemning a generation to submission or suffering. Blackwood had reported Novotná's information to his commanding officer, Captain Richard Walsh, who'd told him that American personnel couldn't provide medical care to anti-communist dissidents without creating diplomatic incidents that might endanger the entire withdrawal. But Blackwood had argued that assessing whether injured students actually existed was different from providing treatment. That if casualties required immediate intervention to prevent death, then American medical ethics required at least determining the facts before political considerations prevented action. Captain Walsh had reluctantly authorized a 30-minute assessment, giving Blackwood permission to examine the situation and report back. If injured students existed and required emergency treatment, Walsh would consider options including contacting Czech medical authorities or attempting evacuation if students could be safely moved. But Blackwood was to conduct only assessment and was to return immediately if the situation appeared dangerous or politically complicated. Blackwood had descended to the school basement at approximately 14:31 hours on May 4th, accompanied by Eva Novotná, who was guiding him to where students were supposedly hiding. According to statements given by medical personnel who'd watched them leave, Blackwood had carried his medical bag, flashlight, and radio for communication with the surface. He'd estimated return by 1500 hours, allowing time to reach the basement, assess injuries, and report findings to Captain Walsh. When 1500 hours passed with no communication from Blackwood, Captain Walsh attempted radio contact. No response. By 1515 hours, with the withdrawal convoy scheduled to depart at 1600 hours, Walsh had organized a search party that descended to the basement by 1523 hours. They found it exactly as described, stone-walled chambers connected by narrow corridors, showing signs of wartime use, but no current occupants. No Blackwood, no Eva Novotná, no injured students. Just empty spaces that echoed with footsteps of searchers calling names that went unanswered. The search party explored every accessible section of the basement throughout the remaining time before withdrawal deadline, finding old storage rooms, coal cellars, and spaces that had apparently been used during German occupation, though for what purposes wasn't immediately clear. They called Blackwood's name repeatedly, examined walls and floors for evidence of concealed passages, and searched for anything explaining where he'd gone. They found nothing conclusive. Captain Walsh faced an impossible choice: delay the withdrawal convoy to continue searching, risking diplomatic incident if American forces remained in Czechoslovakia beyond negotiated deadline, or depart as scheduled, leaving Blackwood behind with hope that he'd contact American authorities through other channels if he was able. Walsh chose departure, reasoning that one missing medic couldn't justify jeopardizing withdrawal of remaining American personnel. He reported Blackwood's disappearance to military command, requested that diplomatic channels be used to locate him, and led the convoy westward, leaving Czech territory as Soviet-backed authorities had demanded. The official investigation conducted over subsequent months was complicated by Communist authorities' refusal to cooperate with American investigators. Requests to search the school thoroughly were denied. Eva Novotná couldn't be located for questioning. Czech civilians in the village claimed ignorance when asked about missing American medic or about students who might have been hiding in the school. The investigation concluded with a report acknowledging only uncertainty. Blackwood had descended to the basement and hadn't emerged. Communist authorities might have detained him for providing assistance to anti-regime dissidents. He might have been killed by security forces or by criminals operating in post-war chaos, or he might have voluntarily remained in Czechoslovakia for reasons investigators couldn't determine. James Blackwood was notified that his brother was missing in action, presumed detained or killed in circumstances under investigation. He spent the rest of his life searching for answers, writing to military authorities, contacting Czech officials after 1989's Velvet Revolution when communication became possible, hiring investigators who found nothing. He died in 2018 still believing that someone knew more about Thomas's fate than they'd admitted. For 76 years, the village school near Plzeň continued serving its educational purpose, transitioning through decades of communist rule, through Solidarity movement's inspiration to Czech dissidents, through Velvet Revolution and democratic transformation. And through all these changes, the school's basement kept its secrets, holding evidence of what had happened to Sergeant Thomas Blackwood on May 4, 1949. In 2024, Czech cultural authorities designated the school for historic preservation, recognizing it as example of early 20th century rural architecture. Renovation work began in December 2024, including structural assessment of the basement to determine what preservation efforts were needed. On February 15, 2025, contractors examining basement walls detected anomalies using modern scanning equipment. Sections of wall showed characteristics suggesting constructed spaces behind them, spaces that architectural plans from multiple periods never acknowledged. Czech authorities contacted American military attachés, informed them about the discovery, and asked whether sealed spaces might contain materials related to American withdrawal in 1949. Archival searches revealed Blackwood's disappearance and its connection to this school. Both Czech and American governments agreed that walls should be carefully breached to determine what they concealed. On May 4, 2025, exactly 76 years after Blackwood's disappearance, excavation specialists carefully removed concealing walls, revealing rooms that would finally explain what Sergeant Thomas Blackwood had discovered on that May day in 1949. The sealed rooms behind the basement walls contained a medical facility that no official records acknowledged had existed. Czech and American investigation teams carefully documented spaces approximately 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, carved from the school's foundations and reinforced with materials bearing both German wartime construction marks and post-war Czech civilian markings. The facility had been deliberately constructed in multiple phases, suggesting it had served purposes that evolved across different political periods. The room's organization revealed a complex history. One section contained medical equipment from the immediate post-war years, surgical instruments, and treatment apparatus that matched what Allied field hospitals had used in 1945 to 1946. But another section held more recent materials, documentation, and supplies, suggesting the facility had continued operating through the 1950s and possibly into the 1960s, treating casualties that communist authorities either couldn't or wouldn't treat through official healthcare channels. The investigation team's first discovery was a medical log near the facility's entrance containing entries in Thomas Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. The log began on May 4, 1949, at 14:34 hours, just minutes after Blackwood had descended the basement stairs following Eva Novotná's guidance. Entered basement as described. Novotná led me past storage rooms to concealed door that opens into constructed medical facility. This isn't makeshift shelter. It's organized treatment center, staffed by Czech physicians and medical students who've been operating here since communist takeover in February 1948. They're treating casualties that regime has made politically invisible, people who need medical care but whom authorities view as enemies, requiring elimination rather than healing. The subsequent entries documented what happened during Blackwood's first hours in the facility, revelations that explained everything about his disappearance. 1,547 hours. I've examined 8 patients here. Most are students who were beaten during anti-communist protests. Some have injuries from labor camp conditions, released prisoners who can't seek follow-up treatment at official hospitals where their medical records would reveal they'd been political detainees. There's also an older man, former doctor, who was dismissed from his hospital position for refusing to certify false psychiatric diagnoses that regime uses to imprison dissidents. He's training younger physicians in techniques that official medical schools no longer teach because communist curriculum emphasizes political reliability over clinical competence. Blackwood's log revealed his growing understanding that the basement facility represented one node in an extensive underground network. 1,634 hours. Dr. Joseph Kratochvil, the physician coordinating this facility, has explained that similar centers operate throughout Czechoslovakia. Medical professionals who opposed communist takeover have been creating parallel healthcare systems, providing treatment that official hospitals either won't provide to politically suspect patients or can't provide because regime has purged medically competent personnel in favor of politically reliable but clinically incompetent loyalists. The network depends on supplies smuggled from the West and on assistance from medical personnel like me who have access to resources that Czech underground can't obtain through official channels. The log documented Blackwood's internal struggle with this revelation over hours spent in the facility throughout the evening of May 4th. Dr. Kratochvil had explained that Czech medical professionals had been coordinating since the 1948 coup, recognizing that communist authorities were transforming healthcare into a tool of political control. Physicians were being required to report patients whose statements or injuries suggested anti-regime activities. Psychiatric diagnoses were being weaponized to imprison dissidents without criminal trials. And medical resources were being allocated based on political reliability rather than clinical need, creating a two-tier system where party members received quality care while politically suspect civilians received minimal or harmful treatment. But Blackwood's log also documented his discovery that the underground medical network involved accepting catastrophic risks. May 4th, 2,247 hours. I've been here 13 hours now. Dr. Kratochvil has shown me the reality of what they're doing. They're saving lives that communist authorities want ended. They're preserving medical ethics in a system that views ethics as bourgeois obstacle to building socialism. And they're doing all of this knowing that if they're discovered, they'll be executed as saboteurs. Every patient they treat, every American supply they accept, every connection they maintain with Western medical personnel creates evidence that could destroy everyone involved and their families. Blackwood had been given the same choice that other Western medical professionals had faced when they'd discovered underground healthcare operations. Leave, report finding empty basement with no evidence of students or medical facilities, and join the withdrawal convoy. Or remain as American liaison, providing supplies and coordination while monitoring the network to ensure its operations didn't create diplomatic incidents that might jeopardize broader U.S.-Czech relations, even as those relations deteriorated into Cold War hostility. Blackwood's decision, documented in entries from May 5th through May 7th, explained why he'd never returned to American forces. May 7th, 15:23 hours. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value American interests. Because I believe medical care that serves healing rather than political control honors my medic oath more truly than field hospital work that treats only casualties deemed acceptable by military or political authorities. I'll serve as American liaison, providing supplies and coordination while ensuring this network doesn't become vehicle for anti-communist operations that would compromise U.S. interests in maintaining diplomatic contact with Czech government even as we oppose that government's policies. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Blackwood had indeed remained in the basement facility and broader underground network for years after his reported disappearance. A second log, covering the period from 1949 to 1957, revealed that Blackwood had lived in various locations across Czechoslovakia, moving between underground facilities, coordinating medical supplies, training underground healthcare workers, and occasionally treating patients when his medic skills were needed for complex trauma cases. This second log painted a detailed picture of Blackwood's life in the underground network during the 1950s, moving constantly to avoid patterns that might alert secret police, coordinating with American military medical personnel who continued smuggling supplies even after official U.S.-Czech relations had been severed, training Czech physicians and medical students in techniques for treating injuries while minimizing evidence that could be used by authorities to identify patients as dissidents, and adapting American military medicine for underground application where resources were scarce. Sterilization was improvised, and detection meant death for everyone involved. The log documented several crises where Blackwood's role had been crucial. In 1950, when secret police discovered one underground facility and arrested its staff, Blackwood had helped evacuate patients to other locations and had coordinated emergency supply redistribution that prevented other facilities from collapsing due to resource shortages. In 1952, when anti-communist resistance intensified following failed workers' protests and casualties overwhelmed underground medical capacity, Blackwood had negotiated emergency assistance from Austrian medical contacts who could provide supplies through border-crossing networks that official authorities couldn't monitor. In 1953, when Stalin's death created brief hope that Soviet policies might liberalize, Blackwood had participated in cautious discussions about whether underground medical operations might transition to semi-official status, perhaps operating as independent clinics that provided care to marginalized populations without directly challenging regime authority. Those discussions had ended when Khrushchev consolidated power and made clear that Soviet control over satellite states would continue, crushing any hopes for meaningful liberalization. In 1956, when Hungarian uprising briefly inspired Czech dissidents to believe that communist control might be challengeable, Blackwood had helped treat casualties from protests that were brutally suppressed, working around the clock as secret police crackdowns created waves of injured dissidents who couldn't seek official medical care without being immediately rearrested. And in early 1957, when exhaustion and accumulated risk made him increasingly liability rather than asset, he'd begun requesting release from network duties. But the log also documented immense personal costs of Blackwood's service. Complete isolation from family in Philadelphia who believed he'd died or been imprisoned. Inability to maintain identity as Thomas Blackwood, living instead under series of Czech false names that changed whenever security considerations required relocating. Growing awareness that his brother James was searching desperately for answers while he lived just across Cold War's Iron Curtain, unable to make contact without compromising network security, and increasing recognition that years of living in constant fear of discovery were taking psychological toll that made him less effective and more dangerous to those he was trying to help. The entries from 1956 to 1957 showed a man wrestling with exhaustion, paranoia, and moral doubt. November 15, 1956. I've been underground 7.5 years. 7 years of treating wounds that communist authorities inflicted, saving lives that regime wants ended, serving purposes that transcend nations but which require living without nationality, without identity, without connections to anything except the work. Dr. Kratochvil argues that we're preserving medical ethics in a system that has corrupted every profession including medicine. But I'm exhausted, and I'm increasingly paranoid, seeing secret police in every stranger, suspecting betrayal in every conversation. That paranoia makes me liability. If I can't trust the people I'm supposed to be helping, I can't function effectively. And if I break under interrogation after arrest, everyone connected to me dies. The log revealed that Blackwood had formally requested release from network duties in early 1957, arguing that he'd served longer than most Western liaisons and that Czech medical professionals were capable of operating independently now that supply networks had been established and training had been completed. The network's coordinating committee had agreed, recognizing that Western personnel who'd served too long under constant threat sometimes became psychologically unstable in ways that endangered everyone around them. But Blackwood's release involved complications that other Western personnel hadn't faced. By 1957, Cold War tensions had intensified to the point where simple exfiltration to the West would create diplomatic incidents if Czech authorities discovered that American medical personnel had been operating underground for years. The network needed to create exit strategy that protected both Blackwood and the underground system he'd been serving, ensuring his departure wouldn't expose networks that needed to continue operating. The solution, documented in entries from spring 1957, involved elaborate deception. Blackwood would be discovered by Czech authorities in circumstances suggesting he'd been hiding alone since 1949, suffering from psychological trauma that made him unable to accurately describe what had happened during 8 years of isolation. He'd be treated as mentally ill rather than criminally culpable, held in psychiatric facility until American diplomatic intervention could secure his release and repatriation. The arrangement would protect Underground Network by ensuring Blackwood's statements under interrogation would be dismissed as delusional, while also providing him with exit from Czechoslovakia that didn't require illegal border crossing that might fail and expose everything. Blackwood's final log entry was dated June 3, 1957. Tomorrow I surface. I'll be found wandering near the Austrian border, confused and unable to explain coherently where I've been since 1949. Czech authorities will treat me as mentally unstable, possibly suffering from trauma related to my disappearance. American diplomats will eventually negotiate my release on humanitarian grounds. I'll be repatriated to the United States, undergo psychiatric evaluation that will determine I'm suffering from amnesia and dissociative episodes that prevent reliable memory of 8 years underground. And I'll spend the rest of my life carrying secrets that can never be revealed, even to James, even to military authorities who deserve to know that I didn't abandon my post but chose to serve medical ethics over military regulations. The investigation team found documentation of Blackwood's discovery and repatriation in files that Underground Network successors had maintained through decades. He'd been found on June 4, 1957, exactly as planned, and had been held in Czech psychiatric facility for 3 months while American diplomats negotiated his release. He'd been repatriated to the United States in September 1957, undergone extensive medical and psychiatric evaluation, and been determined to be suffering from severe PTSD and dissociative amnesia that prevented him from providing coherent account of 8 missing years. He'd received medical discharge from the Army, pension, and veterans benefits, and had lived quietly in Philadelphia from 1958 until his death in 1994 at age 73. He'd never fully recovered psychologically from 8 years underground, struggling with paranoia and trust issues that prevented him from forming close relationships or maintaining steady employment. He'd never married, never established connections that required explaining gaps in his history, and never revealed the truth about his underground service even to James, who'd died in 1992 still believing Thomas had been imprisoned or had suffered psychological breakdown that erased his memories. Most significantly, Blackwood had written a detailed memoir in the final years of his life, a document discovered among materials in the basement facility. The memoir explained what the Underground Medical Network had been, justified his choice to serve it despite consequences for his military service and family relationships, and provided comprehensive documentation of network operations that historians had never possessed. He'd intended the memoir for eventual release, believing that after sufficient time had passed and key participants had died, the story deserved to be told as evidence that some medical professionals had resisted communist attempts to corrupt healthcare into a tool of political control. That memoir provided the most comprehensive explanation of underground healthcare under communist rule that investigators had ever received. Blackwood argued that medical ethics required resisting any political system that transformed healing professions into instruments of oppression. The underground network had been Czech medical professionals' refusal to accept that healthcare could be legitimately subordinated to ideology, that physicians could be required to harm patients for political purposes, or that medical resources could be morally allocated based on party loyalty rather than clinical need. He acknowledged moral complications of his choice. Arguments could be made that he'd abandoned his military post, violated orders to withdraw with American forces, and operated illegally in ways that created diplomatic complications for U.S. government. But he also argued that medical ethics sometimes required choices that conflicted with military regulations or political convenience, that medics who prioritized military obedience over medical necessity betrayed the profession they'd sworn to serve. The most poignant documents in the facility were letters Blackwood had written to James throughout his years underground and after repatriation, letters he'd never sent, but which documented his continuing connection to family he'd abandoned. The letters explained his choices, described his work in underground network, detailed his psychological struggle after repatriation, and asked forgiveness for pain his disappearance and damaged return had caused. The final letter, dated March 7, 1994, just weeks before Blackwood's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. James, you died 2 years ago, never knowing what really happened to me. You believed the psychiatric evaluations that said I'd suffered breakdown and couldn't remember 8 years. But I remembered everything, every patient I treated, every facility I coordinated. Every night I spent terrified that secret police would discover our network and execute everyone I'd been trying to help. I chose to let you believe I'd lost my mind rather than tell you truth that would have required you to keep secrets that might endanger people still operating underground even decades later. Whether that choice was justified, whether protecting Czech medical professionals required lying to my own brother, I honestly don't know. I chose medical ethics over family honesty, and I've paid for that choice every day since June 1957. The Czech government's response to the facility's discovery followed now established patterns. The site was classified at highest security levels. Contents were cataloged under protocols ensuring minimal access, and consultations were held with American government about handling evidence of arrangements that complicated official narratives about Cold War era. Consensus emerged that the facility would be described as underground medical shelter from immediate post-war period now of historical interest, and that truth about Blackwood's service and underground network would be partially declassified while protecting information that might still be sensitive. But Blackwood's family was contacted, given information authorities determined was deserved. In June 2025, James Blackwood's grandson Michael received notification from U.S. Army Medical Corps. Sergeant Blackwood had disappeared in 1949, but not through capture or breakdown. He'd discovered an underground medical facility, had remained to provide coordination under circumstances requiring his official disappearance, and had lived underground until 1957, when he'd been repatriated under cover story that protected both him and network he'd been serving. Michael was given access to some of Blackwood's letters, written to James but never sent, documenting his underground service and his psychological struggles after return. He was shown portions of Blackwood's memoir, explaining his choices and principles he'd believed justified sacrificing career, family relationships, and psychological health, and he was told that his great-uncle had served purposes transcending military medicine, that his sacrifice had contributed to preserving medical ethics under communist rule, and that he'd never stopped regretting pain his choices had caused even as he remained convinced they'd been necessary. The school basement was sealed after excavation, with memorial marker installed acknowledging that American military medic Thomas Blackwood had disappeared at this location in 1949, giving years of his life in service to medical ideals that complicated simple narratives about Cold War loyalties and betrayals. But among those few who knew complete truth, who'd read Blackwood's logs and understood what underground medical network represented, there was acknowledgement that Cold War medical history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some medical professionals had served purposes transcending both military service and political ideology, that preserving medical ethics had sometimes required operations outside official channels and accepting personal costs that destroyed psychological health, and that the line between serving national interests and serving medical principles had been contested in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood had descended school basement stairs on May 4, 1949, and vanished into a world where medical care transcended Cold War divisions. He'd spent 8 years underground and 37 years living with psychological damage caused by constant fear, serving purposes that multiple governments tacitly supported while officially denying. And he'd left behind documents that would remain buried for 76 years before being revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen medical ethics over military service, healing over security, and lifelong trauma over comfortable lies that would have been easier for everyone to accept. The secrets revealed in the Czech school basement weren't crimes but choices, not betrayals, but sacrifices made by medical professionals who believed that healthcare ethics required commitments that neither military service nor political systems could accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Blackwood's choice was ultimately ethical given its costs to him and his family, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Michael Blackwood and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was understanding that disappearance and damaged return had meant something beyond capture or breakdown, that sacrifice had served purposes transcending Cold War divisions, and that sometimes greatest service involved giving up everything, including psychological health, to protect principles that no government owned but all humanity needed preserved for understanding how healing professions survived attempts by totalitarian systems to corrupt them into instruments of oppression. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.